Thank you very much, Dr. Valentin, for those kind words of introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I was delighted to receive the invitation of this university through the initial invitation of Momin Rahman to share with you some thoughts today. And I feel privileged to be part of a conversation that is undoubtedly taking part in this alma mater. I understand it to be a curious and vibrant environment, and I'm thrilled to be here in the context of these celebrations of the 60th anniversary of Trent sociology. I am sure that this is the occasion for each and every one of us to take stock of how much we still have to learn, go out of our zone of comfort, and ask new questions. After over 20 years of work in litigation and civil society, and after having recently completed my tenure with the United Nations, I find myself delighted to come back to academic settings with academic voice and academic freedom, and I am enjoying immensely the privilege that is just being able to sit still and think, even if only for what will probably feel like a few moments. Now, I am clearly in a very privileged position. I'm thrilled to be speaking to you as somebody who, for 6 years, was the custodian of one of the institutions that I consider to be one of the most extraordinary developments in the international human rights machinery, one that I consider to be a global patrimony, and that is the mandate of the United Nations Independent Expert. This mandate, one would hope, that its creation would have signaled or attested to an international consensus about the indispensable need to enhance effective action to protect persons from violence on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Unfortunately, daily acts of violence around the world provide the evidence to immediately dispel that notion. One must make no mistake, a vicious cycle of hatred is being fueled every day in every corner of the world. I am also, as was mentioned, the holder of the Eleanor Roosevelt Chair at the United Nations, Human Rights Program in the Harvard Law School, and I've recently started an academic inquiry into Mrs. Roosevelt's writings and published works. Part of this came about in a really pop culture kind of way because I saw that series, The First Lady. I don't know if you saw. Gillian Anderson did a great job at portraying Mrs. Roosevelt. And part of the series actually depicts what appeared to be a very happy and satisfactory same-sex intimacy that Mrs. Roosevelt actually enjoyed through some of her life. And so that was, let's say, part of the motivation why I was looking into her writings and published works with genuine curiosity as to how she would evaluate the developments concerning sexual orientation and gender identity in international human rights law. The shape of which she did so much to create through her work in the drafting process of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when she reportedly chaired more than 3,000 hours of contentious deliberation to define human rights and decide whether or not they applied to all persons everywhere, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, nationality, age, country of origin, income, and social status. I am only starting that inquiry and will need to peruse thoroughly her published works, but already now I have been able to formulate a working theory that the fundamental manner in which sexual orientation and gender identity could have been construed by Mrs. Roosevelt and her colleagues at the Human Rights Commission, and the manner in which the human rights community today sees them, relates to the passage from the private to the public, from conceiving sexual orientation and gender identity, and sexuality for that matter, as essentially intimate endeavors deserving protection from intrusion, to essentially public manifestations of identity that require full acceptance of occupation of public space in recognition and respect of everyone's orientation and identity. Few areas of concern in international human rights law have evolved as fast and as assertively as this. From 1948 to 1990, it is virtually impossible to find mention of sexual orientation or gender identity in the United Nations human rights work. Treaty bodies and special procedures at the United Nations started their explicit considerations on this matter with criminalization cases. In Tunen, an Australian 1994 case of discrimination resulting from criminalization of same-sex intimacy, the Human Rights Committee crafted an approach that took not only point of departure, but also point of arrival on privacy. This approach, the idea that lesbian and gay persons should be able to enjoy their sexual orientation free from intrusion as long as it was kept in the privacy of their homes or their intimacy of their bedrooms, created some struggles in the world conferences in Cairo and Beijing. One scholar from the Global South put it to me in this way. She said, in order to fight violence, women's rights groups have historically demanded that states come into the bedroom, but to achieve the same objective, gay rights groups have historically demanded that the state stay out. And that tension is what probably led to the historic plea of Beverly Dizzi-Palesa in Beijing to remove the brackets around sexual orientation in the draft declaration and platform for action. Her powerful call, however, was more of a call for stronger framework of this work within the theory of discrimination, one that should place personal autonomy, bodily autonomy, and dignity at the core of protections from discrimination and violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And if I might digress for a minute, these are the essential issues that we're also discussing politically in our times, including, of course, the calls for bodily autonomy that not only impact trans and gender diverse communities everywhere, but also the very crux of sexual and reproductive rights and comprehensive sexual education, to start only with two of the areas that I think are very explicitly impacted by this. Now, we all know Ms. Palesa's claim and request was pitifully disregarded at the time, and it has taken really 30 years to actually undergo this work from that area and from that point of the private to the public. Albeit ill-fated, we find an announcement of it in a Brazilian draft resolution of 2003 and a very significant milestone in Human Rights Council Resolution 1719 presented by South Africa, in which expressed concern for violence and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. It was this last resolution that presented the base for two excellent reports from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, 2011 and 2015, that documented the extent to which lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and gender diverse persons suffered discrimination and violence all around the world. This reinforcement in the work of the UN has also been framed since then by a plethora of statements by United Nations mandate holders and treaty bodies. We could say that this was the second stage of evolution of this area within the work of United Nations. And in my view, there's a strong argument to say that the creation of the mandate that I held signaled the beginning of a third stage in the work on sexual orientation and gender identity within the UN. Indeed, this mandate has a frame conducive to satisfying the call made by many scholars to link this work in a stronger, more integral and coherent manner to other constructs and concerns. The resolution that created the mandate requested it to address multiple intersecting and aggravated forms of violence and discrimination faced by persons on the basis of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And it became immediately clear to me that doing this work of analysis required a multidimensional assessment of all factors, including historical, sociocultural, political, and anthropological, that have concurred to create an understanding of what is perceived as a norm, perhaps even as a desirable norm, in relation to gender, in relation to sex, and in relation to sexual pleasure and desire in a given place and at a given time. All of this, of course, within the frame of understandings of intersectional approaches. For instance, a woman feeling profound emotional, affective, and sexual attraction for other women may choose to self-identify as bisexual or as a lesbian. But she will also identify with other equally relevant identities that shape who she is in the space and time in which she lives. The fabric of a lived experience gets woven by the threads of race, ethnicity, religion or belief, health, status, age, and class. We hold many identities in one body, one stakeholder said to me. And violent actions against persons oftentimes result from intersecting factors that create a continuum of violence and a dynamic of disempowerment. The reality of the work that I carried out during the last 6 years is that I received in sexual orientation and gender identity a point of entry into an analysis that necessarily takes all of those factors into account. It is only a point of entry because nobody, in my experience, has a particular positionality of privilege or exposure to risk of discrimination and violence just because of one of those identities. We could also imagine that intersectional frameworks could help us understand dynamic processes in which unique and distinctively unique life experience occurs, varying in relation to time. We are the first generations who are facing dilemmas at the level of public policy associated with large numbers of aging LGBT persons who have built free and open lives within their communities, but yet are facing care and retirement systems that are unprepared and insensitive to their needs. We are also the first generation to address, at the level of public policy, medical and public policy questions derived from long-term use of antiretrovirals and hormones, both statistically significant factors within the gay and trans communities. Through my work on health, I came to understand the depth to which being gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, or gender diverse actually impacts a person's health. Just for one example. In 2019, I reported to the UN General Assembly that while I have received consistent information suggesting that LGBT older persons are under extreme risk created by social isolation and discrimination, research and data on the root causes of these lived realities, and most importantly, the dynamics to reverse them is extremely scarce. The little information that exists in a handful of countries is, without exception, in the global north, painting a deeply worrisome picture. My 2023 visit to the United Kingdom revealed that LGBT older persons are less likely to be in contact with their biological family frequently, more likely to drink alcohol, take drugs, and have a history of poor mental health, and to have been diagnosed with depression. All of this having been identified as risk factor for cognitive decline and dementia. The same can be said of HIV/AIDS, which, as is well documented, impact disproportionately the key populations of men who have sex with men and trans women. The life concerns of LGBT persons also vary in relation to space. The experience of violence and discrimination is absolutely different if one lives in the city or in a rural space. And persons are oftentimes forced to leave their families, their communities, and their countries as a result of violence and discrimination through axes that actually follow that path of the rural towards the urban. One of the most striking findings that I had as independent expert is that it is quite possible that a lesbian from Rio de Janeiro has a lot more in common with a lesbian in New York than what she will have with a lesbian woman in Manaus, in Brazil. The asymmetries of the rural and the urban are so striking that they really reveal to us that it is a fiction to work, as we do, in terms of state analysis at the higher level of public policy. Now, I believe that you may know or may have heard that the mandate of the independent expert was created in 2016 in the midst of furious controversy. Regional blocs within the Human Rights Council, namely the Community of Independent States, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the African Group, vociferously claimed that it was a creature of the global north, that it answered to artificial concerns that do not exist in their jurisdictions, and that its creation and that the recognition of the work on sexual orientation and gender identity threatened to create a cultural schism within the work of the community of nations. Beneath that argumentation laid a powerful homophobic message that this work is created and pursued to promote homosexuality and same-sex marriage around the world. In their last statement denouncing my work on religion and freedom from violence and discrimination, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation only last year accused me of constantly trying to, quote unquote, normalize the existence of LGBT persons. And I found myself actually quite wonderfully agreeing with them. It is precisely the work of actually trying to understand that there's absolutely nothing extraordinary in these existences. That report, for example, had nothing but the intention of making a call to the community of nations so that freedom of religion and belief is understood as allowing LGBT persons to reclaim their capacity to be considered and to consider themselves as spiritual beings, and essentially as moral beings. One claim that is difficult in the context of highly politicized and controversial debate of our days, in which one side that promotes regression in terms of the human rights of LGBT persons claims a moral superiority because it is allegedly defending the moral fabric of society, or call it traditional values, or the normal way in which society should look. Leave your hand out of our religion was the message, but this message is as common and as marketed in other type of contexts. Leave your hands out of my children is what gay men are told when they try to be teachers in different contexts of the world. Leave your hands out of my children is what comprehensive sexual education advocates are told everywhere in the world. It is this idea of creating a notion of otherness and of moral panic against the very moral fabric of LGBT persons. Now, throughout my tenure, I carried out 12 thematic inquiries. Many of them related to social inclusion, but I covered the span also concerning freedom of religion and belief, and also the examination of the impact of colonialism in the construction of social mores relating to sexual orientation and gender identity. Colonialism, part of the colonial project, I should say, utilize heteronormative models as ways to erode, in very many contexts, the social structures of support that existed and that resisted the imposition of colonial project. They contributed also to the creation of local elites that would themselves replicate colonial models, and as you probably know, they also left a legacy of criminalization of same-sex intimacy, as a result of which, as of today, 1 out of every 4 persons in the world is born in contexts that criminalize same-sex intimacy. It impacts also social inclusion. My inquiries showed that in all corners of the world, LGBT persons continue to remain excluded and marginalized. Violence and discrimination are perpetrated in a wide variety of public and private settings. All over the world, political campaigns, parliamentary debates, and public manifestations reveal social prejudice and misconception about the nature and moral character of LGBT persons. We also see the rise of ultra-conservative and ultra-nationalist groups reclaiming so-called identities at the expense of sexual and gender minorities, challenging, advancing, and preventing the development of laws and policies inclusive of LGBT persons. The issues faced by LGBT persons are often instrumentalized by political and religious leaders as a threat to national cohesion, culture, and tradition, in particular in periods of political and socioeconomic stability. LGBT persons become the other, the foreign, whose sole purpose is to undermine the national project from within. All these impacts on the social inclusion of LGBT persons and negatively affects their access to health, education, housing, employment, political participation, and personal security, and freedom from violence. My findings time and time again came to one single fact. A number of structural processes have been put in place in societies all around the world to perpetuate the notion that certain genital configurations determine a certain role in society and guide who you must love, feel attraction, or desire. This primal ordering principle has been instrumentalized through a series of mechanisms that I have come to qualify as negation and stigma, the latter translated in demonization, criminalization, and pathologization. Sin, crime, and illness. That's the formula. The great proportion of violence and discrimination perpetrated every day around the world has, in my view, a connection to one or several of those mechanisms. We have been in operation for centuries, and that have carved deep grooves in the collective consciousness of people everywhere. At school, LGBT pupils face abuse, including physical violence, social isolation, humiliation, and death threats that result in feelings of unsafety, missed school days, and reduced chances of academic success. In the field of employment, LGBT persons also face discrimination and abuse in all regions and in all stages of employment: hiring, advancement, training, compensation, and termination, and in the implementation of benefits throughout. Forced to conceal their sexual orientation and gender identity, this leads to considerable anxiety and loss of productivity. Similar findings resulted from my analysis in relation to access to housing, for example, and as well as other areas of social life. In particular, due to the pathologization of trans identities, many countries have put in place abusive medical and other requirements to the legal recognition of such identities. Pathologization has also had a nefarious consequence on so-called conversion therapies and involuntary institutionalization of LGBT persons to quote-unquote cure them of same-sex attraction or their gender identity. This led me to create a call, and part of 3 global calls that I did at the end of my mandate, which are the global calls for a world free of criminalization, a world of recognition of gender identity, and a world free of conversion therapy. I think several contexts, and particularly in the global north, are making significant strides towards legislation that bans or eliminates conversion therapy. But we are seeing a regression in what relates to criminalization, and recent developments in Uganda and only this week in Ghana call us to reflection in relation to criminalization and the way in which our siblings all around the world are actually having to face increased state-sponsored discrimination and violence. Not only the law is at the origin of these processes of exclusion. Racialization, ethnicity, age, color, disability, national and residential and socioeconomic status expose LGBT persons to different forms of discrimination that do affect their ability to enjoy human rights and fundamental freedoms. To adequately analyze how structural inequalities lead to violence and exposure to risk, it is a must to adopt the intersectional approach that I had mentioned. In the few contexts, however, in which systematic data collection exists, it strongly suggests that the intersection of anti-Blackness and LGBT phobia creates additional barriers to the full inclusion of Black LGBT persons in society. Similar dynamics affect other discriminated or racialized groups, such as Arab, Asian, Latin American, and Middle Eastern persons, persons of African or Pacific descent, as well as indigenous peoples, minorities, migrant persons, refugees, and asylum seekers. These factors are exacerbated for people who are sexually or gender diverse and for those defending their rights. The lack of intersectional approaches often precludes culturally relevant engagement, public participation without fear of reprisal, necessary comprehensive medical care, and basic respect for autonomy. The persistence of gender inequality and a lack of understanding of sexual and gender diversities drives prejudice in culture and discrimination, in laws and policies in a range of country contexts. Challenging historic exclusion and more contemporary regressions by breaking stereotypes and ensuring civil society's access to financial resources, including laws, policies, and practices, and to challenge laws and practices that impede such access is a must in the global human rights agenda. Businesses also have a responsibility to address intersectional harms experienced by individuals, including persons with non-binary identities, and to take social justice into consideration as part of their human rights responsibilities under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It is not enough to commit to equality and diversity initiatives. This must be accompanied by human rights due diligence assessments that bring non-discrimination to practice. For all of these reasons, I mentioned that while I'm convinced that sexual orientation and gender identity remain indispensable entry points for an adequate analysis of discrimination and violence and the path to its eradication, I also believe that the challenges that LGBT communities face will only be adequately addressed when they are placed in this context of wider social justice considerations. Most of the asymmetries of power that affect LGBT persons gravitate around intersections between sexual orientation and gender identity and race, migratory status, and national or social origin. The duty to tackle those structural drivers includes the close examination and the challenging of structures that facilitate racialized exclusion and the active opposition to structures that facilitate racialized exclusion, as is the case of international migration law and so many national immigration policies around the world that are structured precisely to exclude African, Afro-descendant, Asian, Latin American, and Arab world persons in ways that are simply not the case of migrants from the global north. Of course, this picture that I've painted seems rather bleak, but immense progress has been achieved in the last decades to deconstruct, institutionalize discriminatory systems, myths and stereotypes, and to foster inclusion of LGBT persons. In the past 20 years, 29 countries from all regions have taken steps to decriminalize same-sex intimacy between consenting adults. And more than 50 countries around the world have adopted anti-discrimination legislations. Many states also made important strides with respect to gender recognition and the removal of abusive requirements. In this particular case, however, the advance is, as I was mentioning, currently under threat. The use of narratives concerning trans persons and gender identity as part of political narratives that promote moral panic and an instrumentalization of the life of trans persons for political purposes is not only a real risk, it's an absolute reality in vast regions of this world. I mentioned that in 2023 I carried out a visit to the United Kingdom where I actually found that deep instrumentalization of trans identities is part of the prevailing political discourse, and I achieved exactly the same type of findings out of my country visit to the United States earlier that same year. There is something that is deeply appealing in the political profit that is to be found in instrumentalizing the lives of trans persons, and in ensuring that through that instrumentalization, easy political narratives are going to translate into the galvanizing of political bases. Since political campaigns are built around the issue, usually political action after election comes in relation to the issue. And it's translating into an unprecedented number of legislations around the world, certainly in the countries that I have mentioned, restricting the rights of gender diverse persons and adopting narratives that have no basis in evidence. One of the examples that is most striking is the number of governors of states in the United States that have promoted legislation excluding trans women from sports, who were asked how many cases of trans women participating in sports existed in the state, a near majority of which actually was not aware of even one case behind that legislation. It's a point about how these narratives are not based on evidence and propelled by evidence, but on deep prejudice. Indeed, part of the solution I found is to recognize certain premises as part of the political realities of any party. First, that persons who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, or otherwise gender diverse make a significant contribution to society, to the social fabric. Second, that their aspiration of being themselves and finding happiness is an expression and an exercise of their human rights. I do believe that Mrs. Roosevelt would actually connect with this, since she so intently advocated for the idea of including the pursuit of happiness as part of the preamble of the Universal Declaration. And third, tying those principles together, that satisfaction of human rights of LGBT persons is not only a must, but also the key to unleashing that possibility and that potential for happiness and that contribution to the social fabric. A notion of duty, a notion of right, at the same time, which is what transpires, I think, from the body of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. None of the measures adopted will, however, have impact if perpetrators of violence and discrimination enjoy impunity for their actions. Not only if they enjoy impunity, but if they actually reap profit from their actions. And so part of the work that I think it's the agenda in the future, is to ensure that there is a political cost to the instrumentalization of the human rights of LGBT persons. At the beginning of these words, I spoke of Eleanor Roosevelt's conception of human rights. And I did also say that I was only at the beginning of my inquiry, and this is why this speech has very little to do with what the title says, because I actually don't know what Eleanor Roosevelt would say. I know what the character in the series would say, but I don't know what she would say in relation to these issues. But she famously said, and I imagine many of you know this quote, she said, after all, where do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood they live in, the school or college they attend, the factory, farm, or office where they work. Such are the places where every person seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the gist of it. I think that there was a connection there between the fact that the places were not so small that she was referring to. It was not only the idea that sexual orientation and gender identity should remain part of the traits that a person had to only enjoy in the most secret intimacy, but that contribute in that juxtaposition of identities to the creation of personas that we deserve to be in public space, and that we deserve to occupy public space with a full ownership of that persona. That it is necessary to be able to talk about your spouse around the water cooler, that it is necessary not to fear to disclose to a landlord that you are in a same-sex relationship, and very importantly, that it is an absolute must that the bodily autonomy of persons be respected as an ultimate manifestation of freedom and of dignity. From there derive the notion that comprehensive sexual education is important. From there derives the notion that the rights of gender diverse children are not only determined by the rights of parents or the rights of families, but by a composite of rights that actually need to take into account not only the contribution of the family, but the best interest of the child and the notion of incremental capacity of children. Recognition of capacity and agency are these fundamental concepts. This idea, that I don't know if I'm extrapolating too much, but I think Eleanor Roosevelt was articulating when speaking of persons living in these contexts. And she didn't leave children out, and she didn't leave anybody out of this conception. Her idea was that everybody should be living as they were born, free and equal in dignity and rights, as is the language of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Yet, every day, hundreds and thousands of persons around the world are killed, they are beaten, they are tortured, they are mistreated because of who they are and who they desire or who they love. Millions are simply excluded without the tools to partake the benefits of the social fabric. And in the contexts where significant gain has been made, it is never a given that it will be sustainable. It takes only one election for change to happen in the most brutal of ways. So, while wishing you wholeheartedly a great week of celebrations on the 60th anniversary, I ask now that we continue a conversation, that we recognize ourselves as human rights advocates, as everyone should be, and that we listen and learn from each other as to what should be the new answers that we provide so that this enormous need can be satisfied 75 years after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the millions of persons for whom it is simply not a reality. Thank you very much.